Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. Okay, so I figured if I was going to start the series of videos on the lore of the King's Fall raid, we really needed to start from somewhat of the beginning. I wanted to cover the Touch of Malice originally, and I think that's still going to be a good second or third video to make, but I think we're really going to need to talk about King's Fall in depth by starting with who Oryx is. Now I know that this is going to be retreading a lot of old ground for those of you who've played the series for years, but for those of you who haven't even seen Oryx up until this point, who've only heard whispers and odd bits here and there, this is going to be important. This is going to be a review and sort of a vague overview of one of Destiny's greatest villains. So today, we're going to give the briefest overview of who Oryx is, and for those of you who know all of it, I'm sure this is going to be an opportunity to go over some bits of more obscure lore about Oryx that you might have missed. So don't worry, there's stuff in here for everyone. But first, a word from our sponsors at Outplayed. What is Outplayed? Well, it's really easy. It's an app that runs in the background and it collects the highlights and best clips that you have while you're playing any game that you've got. There's over 300 compatible games, Destiny 2 is one of them, and it's actually really easy to go ahead and take those clips that you've created and then just upload them straight away to the internet so you can show them off to your friends. Send them to YouTube or Discord. You can even really easily edit them down and clip them as you need, so that you can cut out all the bad stuff and keep all the good. Download Outplayed for free down below in the description. Thank you very much to Outplayed for sponsoring this video. Anyway, back to the lore. So, as far as the big bads of Destiny are concerned, Oryx is really the very first that we ever saw that challenged us and changed the world in a serious manner. Back in Destiny 1, he was a villain heralded by a villain, an expansion hinted to by an expansion, and his arrival was the first point at which the game of Destiny truly changed on a macro level. That was due to the Taken arriving and infesting literally every destination in the game. Let's not worry about all of that to start with, let's think about Oryx's origins really briefly. And for those of you wondering, yes, you can absolutely just get a lot more detail on this particular part of it all by just watching Dynasty, but I'm here to give you the bigger picture and some important details along the way. Oryx and his two sisters, Xivu-Arath and Savathûn, were originally a triarch of sisters known as Urash, Shiro, and Sathona. This was in the time before the Hive were called the Hive. Back in this time, they were known as the Krill and lived on a massive gas giant world called Fundament that had deep oceans below its layers of many clouds. Now, the Krill, as they were known at the time, lived short but hard lives on Fundament and scratched out an existence through their hardship. But they, at one point, were supposedly going to be chosen by the Traveler to be uplifted. It's here that the Witness intervened. You see, before they could be uplifted, the Witness initiated its plan to corrupt the Krill. Initially, it sent its first disciple, Rulk, down into the crushing depths of Fundament's oceans to subjugate Shaita, the Worm Mother. In exchange for this, Shaita's children, the Worm Gods, were given power and roped into the plan to corrupt the Krill. A dead worm larvae then mysteriously washed up from the deep ocean. I say mysteriously, it's quite deliberate that this happened. It was then picked up by the father of the three sisters, Urash, Sathona, and Shiro, the old Osmium king whose name we still do not know. Eventually, this worm was passed to Sathona, who would hear the whispers of the worm insisting that they should venture down into the depths of Fundament's oceans. There, the three siblings found the Worm Gods, who offered them immortality in exchange for a constant blood tithe. Though the nature of the deal wasn't quite expanded on by the time that they actually heard the deal, the three siblings would eventually accept. And this is the moment at which the three siblings began to transform. They turned from Urash, Shiro, and Sathona into Oryx, Xivu-Arath, and Savathûn. They then went on to corrupt and uplift the rest of their species, and thus the Krill were transformed into the Hive. They were the eternal servants of the Witness at this point, and whilst they didn't truly discover the nature of their place in its hierarchy for quite some time, they would serve it loyally for billions of years, and all the same, they didn't seem to care. By this point, their corruption was so far gone and this was the only life they could conceive of. At least, this was the only life that most of them could conceive of. The Hive would go on to fight countless wars against many civilizations and would become stronger up until the point that they stepped into a war with a stellar empire known as the Acumenae. When they discovered that the Acumenae were too great, Oryx and his two sisters communed in Oryx's throne world in order to divine a solution, and it's here that Oryx decided to kill his two sisters and then Akka, the worm god of secrets. From the power that he'd accumulated and from the secrets he'd learned from Akka, he gained the power necessary to commune with the deep, as well as the power of the Witness to be able to pull things into a dimension of darkness. This power, in its greatest form, is literally capable of abducting whole planets, but in the case of Oryx, it showed him a way to corrupt the forces of his enemies and to turn them into mindless thralls that would fight for him. These would be known as the Taken. Oryx inscribed these secrets that he had learned from Akka onto a series of tablets that he called the Tablets of Ruin, and they would hang about his waist. When he went out into the universe next, he proclaimed himself to be the Taken King, which is where his title comes from. He used the Taken to decimate the Acumenae and declared his dominion over the Hive from that moment onward. His power was so great at this point that he would actually be able to bring back Xivu-Arath and Savathun after true deaths, simply by embodying them and thus manifesting them back into the universe. Oryx's power would go on to become utterly remarkable from this point. It was so excessive that Savathun and Xivu-Arath actually departed from him and his Hive swarm because they were so overwhelmed by his power, and they needed time and space apart from their brother to develop differently so that they might develop at all. So we can tell from all of this history alone that Oryx is quite literally the meanest thing the Hive have known, and for the longest time, wherever there were Hive in our system, you could feel his very subtle influence. This is greatest displayed by the actions of his son, Crota, who was responsible for the greatest defeat that Guardians had ever suffered. The event is so terrible that in Destiny's history it is literally called the Great Disaster. But there's a whole lot of stuff that you probably didn't know about Oryx, and so today we're going to fill in some of those gaps further. Firstly, when comparing his actual powers, it's entirely the case that he's comparable to beings such as Rulk in terms of stature within the Witness's hierarchy, although Rulk undoubtedly comes out on top given his placement in the Witness's hierarchy as its first disciple. He has personally spoken to the Witness and has been given insight into the end of the universe as the Witness wishes it to be. Oryx would, from that point, become obsessed with trying to embody the Witness's goal. His obsession was to live forever and to claim the secrets of the final shape so that he might become one with it. And so it was that in many of his actions he attempted to emulate the Witness. That is to say, he attempted to emulate what he understood of the Witness. That which is formless and yet sharp. One of the key ways in which Oryx did this was with his echoes. Just in the same way that the Witness seldom stepped beyond the veil into our universe, Oryx attempted to accomplish the same thing by sending out shades of himself cloaked in dark energies to accomplish his goals. His actions in embodying the sword logic led to the obvious brutality of his conquests, and it is said that by the time he arrived in Sol, he had become as a syllogism of the sword logic and the final shape. This is to say that he was often closely associated with it. Where he walked, often it would follow. However, Oryx's plan was to become an axiom to it. In other words, to make it law that wherever he trod, the final shape was present merely by his association. For a Hive, he is the most powerful thing they can hope to become, and also he represents what was to many of them the apex of their accomplishment. He represents the closest that a Hive can come to perfection, having attained godhood and having become one of the closest confidants of the Witness, a harbinger of the final shape. But it was not by his power alone that Oryx gained his authority. He gained power because he was supported by those below him in station, who tithed tribute up to him. This is one of the mechanics of the Hive that Oryx imposed personally. The Hive are peculiar beings because of the fact that they need this destruction to exist. Without sowing destruction and the ruin that they reap from it being their reward, they cannot feed their worms. If they don't feed their worms, they will be unable to survive, as the hunger of the worms will then destroy them. Thus, they require an endless blood tithe in order to live and maintain their immortality, as well as their power. However, Oryx was in his own way a shrewd political operator, and in this sense, politics for the Hive is very much a real life and death consequence, because if you have power over someone else, it means you also control their life and all the things that they tithe. Oryx created this system. After having destroyed the Ecumene and set many of their worlds to the torch, Oryx declared that all the Hive that gained sustenance from conquest and destruction would then have to tithe a portion of that conquest up to their superiors. Thralls would tithe up to acolytes, acolytes to knights and wizards, and eventually, all those beneath Oryx would tithe until that destruction reached all the way up to him, at the apex of their civilization. In doing so, Oryx essentially created a system by which he was always given an excessive amount of destruction, whilst those at the base had to struggle and survive. This is one of those systems that meant that he was perpetually in power until something greater than him could dethrone him. And yes, for those of you wondering, this is very much the same kind of structure as a pyramid scheme. Great irony indeed. There were also certain key elements of his hierarchy that were powerful in their own right and allowed him to maintain power much more easily. Powerful Ascendant Hive in particular were crucial to his power. See those that roamed within the High War, also known as the Court of Oryx, those who were capable of tithing great power to him. But then there are others that have to be mentioned, those who are even closer to him. Ascendant Hive such as his son Crota, the Light Eater, his daughters Ur-Halak, the Unraveler, and Uranuk, the Weaver, and the War Priest, all of whom helped Oryx to maintain his power. Many of these individuals were members of his family, and it's important to understand that because family for the Hive is an important part of their civilization. How important exactly? Well, it's important enough to die over and to kill over. To kill over a lot, in fact. Hive familial bonds are not like those of humans, and there's a simple reason for that. To them, love is war, and war is love. There is no greater respect or gift that one can show than to bring them closer to the truth of the final shape. This is for the eyes of the Hive, that is. They do this by sharpening themselves and becoming stronger in the process, and they do so by making war with those that they also desire to make strong. Oryx and his family have embodied this well. The three Hive God siblings have killed each other countless times and have gained much knowledge of combat in the process, as well as the means by which they might survive. Thus, they show their affection to each other, because their rivals are not strong enough to survive and learn. Thus, they are not worthy of such knowledge and such experience that molds them into what the Hive perceive as something greater. The growth that one obtains from experience and survival through combat by claw and blade and darkness is something that the Hive treasure, and if they can share it amongst themselves, they will. In their early days, the Hive were at war with themselves for 20,000 years, growing strong and sharp as they fought to maintain their supremacy and start to grow in power in the time between the spaces of Fundament and their next quarry. This is realistically the best way to understand the Hive. They value strength, and when you understand that strength can only come from conflict, it is only a natural act of love to invite conflict on those that you care for. Because if you did not care for them, you wouldn't want to see them grow. Those that have stood against Oryx are not all remembered. Most of them have been lost to the sands of time, as all memory of their civilizations has been erased. The world's grave, the ancient record of the Hive's history, tells us nothing of many of those who were defeated. But we know, at very least, that before Oryx arrived in Sol, he had previously fought both the Eliksni and the Cabal. The Eliksni saw Chelchis, the Kell of Stone, fall to the forces of Oryx and the witness at the last stand made by the Eliksni at Reese after the Traveler had left them and the whirlwind had begun. The Cabal had seen scout legions led by a certain Primus Arn killed to a man, word of which had clearly made its way back to the high command of the Cabal Empire, including the likes of Evocate General and Primus of all legions Umuna Rath. Umuna Rath, remember, is the one that would go on to train Empress Keitel and to warn her of the dangers that the Hive presented to any who opposed them. In this strange way, the sword logic that Oryx has imposed upon his foes and his friends alike has made strange ripples that have even touched the life of the current Empress of the Cabal. There are also those countless others that have fallen in his wake. The Helium Drinkers of Fundament, the Ammonite of Fundament's moons, the Kugu, the Cumene, the Harmony, and the Taisha Beth. There are billions of souls that have been fed into the power of his blade and the blades of his followers. He has become mighty indeed by their deaths. And speaking of blades, one of the last things we'll touch on today is Oryx's powerful blade that is known as Willbreaker, and its name was well earned. It was capable of cutting the strands of one's mind and tearing them apart by the force of Oryx's determination. Once Oryx fell, the blade came to pass to us. We would discover one of the reasons for its power. It was made of a substance known as hadium, a metal not native to our solar system, one which was capable of containing within its bounds some measure of paracausal power. Hadium is, in this sense, a special material because it can be empowered by the light or the darkness. We would know this is how we crafted Dark Drinker, Raise Lighter, and Boltcaster back in Destiny 1. Flakes of hadium, this strange material, can still be found lingering about the remains of the Dreadnought, and a weapon of such construction would be mighty indeed. From here, there is still a lot more to say about Oryx, but I really want to leave it all up to you. What should I speak about first when I talk about Oryx and King's Fall? Do you want the lore of specific encounters? Are there choice questions that you want answered? Do you want to know about the Touch of Malice or the weapons that we obtain from the raid? Let me know what you want to see, and I'll check the comments section down below to see what you guys want me to talk about next. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, and if you want more Destiny lore, go ahead and hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications. But as per usual, know that your viewership is quite enough for me, and that in the meantime, my name is Byf. Per audacia ad astra. I'll see you, Starside.